My name is Evelyn Carter, and I'm 35 years old. Every Thanksgiving at my parents' house followed the same painful routine. My younger sister, Claire, was celebrated like a hero, while I was treated like the family disappointment. This year felt no different, until my parents made one mistake they could never take back. By the end of dinner, the $100 bill my father pushed across the table would become the most expensive insult of his life. I arrived early carrying my grandmother's green bean casserole. The house was already full of relatives. 17 family members had gathered around the dining room, laughing and catching up before dinner. "You're here," my mother Linda said with a forced smile. "Set your dish in the kitchen." Before I could answer, the front door opened again. Claire walked in wearing an elegant cream blazer, her husband following with an expensive bottle of wine. The entire room lit up. "My brilliant daughter is here," my mother announced as she hugged Claire. She was just promoted to chief of cardiac surgery at St. Matthew's Medical Center. Everyone applauded. My father looked prouder than ever. I quietly slipped into my chair without anyone asking how I'd been. Once dinner began, my mother tapped her glass. "I just want everyone to know how proud we are of Claire," she said. "She saves lives every single day." Another round of applause filled the room. Then she looked at me. "And Evelyn," she said with a smirk. "She still cleans for a living." The room fell silent. A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody questioned her. My father reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the table. "Here," he said with a chuckle. "Go mop something." A few nervous laughs followed. I stared at the money without touching it. Years ago, I would have cried. Tonight, I simply smiled. Because none of them knew the truth. They had spent years believing I cleaned hospitals. In reality, I helped run them. And before Thanksgiving dinner ended, every person at that table, including my parents, would discover exactly who I really was. The $100 bill stayed exactly where my father had left it, resting on the tablecloth like an unexploded bomb. Nobody reached for it. Nobody spoke. My mother kept staring, waiting for me to break down or snap. But I had learned years ago that absolute composure makes people far more uncomfortable than anger ever could. I calmly picked up my fork and took another bite of dinner. The uneasy laughter around the table quickly died down. "What?" my mother finally spat out, annoyed. "Nothing to say?" I looked up, meeting her gaze with a calm, polite smile. "No, Mom, I'm just enjoying the food." She frowned. That wasn't the humiliating reaction she had paid for. The truth was, I had stopped defending myself a long time ago. Whenever I used to mention my career, my parents would dismiss it or change the topic within seconds. Eventually, I realized they didn't care about the truth. They simply preferred the weak version of me they had invented in their own minds. Across the table, my grandmother rose, watched everything in dead silence. She didn't say a word. Not yet. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking at me. "Evelyn, Mom didn't mean it like that." I held her eyes. I know exactly how she meant it. An awkward silence fell over the room once again. My father cleared his throat, suddenly feeling the shift in the room's energy. "So, where are you actually working these days?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I couldn't help but smile. It was the first time he had asked me about my job in over 10 years. "I'm still in healthcare," I replied smoothly. My mother waved her hand dismissively. "See? Hospital sanitation is honest work. There's no shame in it." A few relatives nodded politely, avoiding my eyes. I didn't correct her. Not because she was right, but because she had never cared enough to ask. Then, the soft clink of silver echoed through the silent dining room. Grandma Rose slowly placed her fork on her plate, set her napkin down, and looked directly at my mother. "Linda," Grandma said, her voice piercing the air. "Why don't you tell everyone where Evelyn actually works?" My mother's arrogant smile vanished instantly. She opened her mouth and closed it again. For the first time all evening, panic flashed in her eyes. She glanced at me, then back at the table. "Evelyn works in hospital administration," she said, her voice suddenly lacking its usual confidence. Grandma Rose raised an eyebrow. "Administration where, Linda?" Silence, absolute suffocating silence. 17 relatives stared at my mother, waiting for an answer she didn't have. She looked at me with pleading eyes, silently begging me to bail her out. Instead, I carefully folded my linen napkin, placed it next to the undisturbed $100 bill, and stood up. If my family finally wanted to know who I really was, they were about to find out. Every eye in the room followed me as I stood. My father slowly pulled his hand back from the $100 bill, as if it had suddenly burned him. I took a steady breath, holding everyone's gaze. "I'm the Chief Operating Officer of North Valley Health Network," I said calmly. "I oversee 4 hospitals across the state, including St. Matthew's Medical Center." The room went completely still. Claire's smile vanished. "What?" she whispered. "The hospital where you were just promoted reports directly through the network I manage." My mother's face drained of color. "That's impossible. I've worked there 12 years, I replied. "I started as an analyst, worked through management, and joined the executive team 3 years ago. I don't perform surgeries. Mom, I run the facilities, equipment and budgets." I turned to my father. "The cardiac clinic where you have your annual checkups is part of my network." His shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than ever. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" My mother choked out. A sad smile crossed my face. "I tried. Every time I got promoted, I tried to speak. But within a minute, the conversation was always turned back to Claire. I stopped explaining because none of you were listening." Claire lowered her head. "I remember," she admitted quietly. Grandma Rose gave a small nod from the end of the table. "I've known for years," she said, her voice piercing the silence. She looked directly at my mother. "You were so busy bragging about one daughter that you forgot to learn anything about the other." Nobody argued. The truth was undeniable. I reached for the $100 bill, folded it once, and gently slid it back across the table to my father. "I don't need your money," I said. "I only wanted your respect." My father couldn't meet my eyes. My mother stared at her plate, tears finally spilling over. For the first time in my life, neither of them had anything left to say. No one spoke for several long, suffocating seconds. The only sound left in the dining room was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. My father stared at the folded $100 bill resting in front of him as if it were a ghost. Finally, with visibly trembling fingers, he picked it up. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was just making a joke." I shook my head, keeping my voice steady. "No, Dad, you weren't making a joke. You were making a judgment." He flinched, unable to hold my gaze, and slowly lowered his eyes. "I should have asked about your life years ago." "You should have," I replied softly. "But it's never too late to start listening." Across the table, my mother wiped away a tear that escaped down her cheek. "I spent so many years bragging that Claire was our only success story," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never realized I stopped actually seeing you. For the first time in 35 years, her words sounded painfully sincere instead of rehearsed. Claire pushed her chair back, walked around the long dining table, and stood in front of me. "I'm so sorry too, Evelyn," she said, her eyes glistening. I should have noticed what was happening. I should have asked questions instead of just soaking up the praise. A soft, genuine smile finally touched my face. "This was never about your success, Claire. You earned every bit of it. I just wanted someone in this family to believe my life mattered too." She pulled me into a tight embrace, and after years of emotional distance, I hugged my sister back. From the head of the table, Grandma Rose folded her hands and smiled gently. "I've waited a very long time for this family to finally tell the truth." Several relatives quietly nodded in agreement. The rest of the evening shifted completely. Nobody talked over me. Nobody introduced me as the daughter who cleaned hospital hallways. Instead, they asked about my executive team, my daily decisions, and the health networks I managed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible in my own family. When the night came to an end, my father walked me out to my car in the quiet evening air. "I hope you'll come back next Thanksgiving," he said, looking at me with new eyes. "I will," I replied, opening my car door. "But only if I'm invited as your daughter, not as the story you created to feel superior." He nodded without a second of hesitation. "You have my word." As I drove away into the night, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The greatest victory was never about exposing my parents or proving them wrong. It was finally refusing to make myself small just to fit inside their narrow narrative. And that realization was worth infinitely more than a $100 bill. Subscribe to Revenge Diaries for more shocking family betrayals, satisfying karma, and emotional